Today we're doing another AniLysis, and today we're doing it on one of the most famous locations in the Animorphs series. It is, of course, the construction site. Now, this isn't an actual image of the construction site of the series, but I think this is sort of what we're looking at when we come to this. So before I actually go into details on why I think this is a good representation of what it would look like, let's firstly look at how this place is described in the books. We all have pictures in our heads of this place. It was done in the TV show as well, and I think, to be fair, the TV show did a pretty good job with showing the construction site. So let's take a look at some of those descriptions in quote form. It was a big area, surrounded on two sides by trees, with the highway separating it from the mall area. There's a broad open field between the construction site and the nearest houses. It's a very isolated place. Originally it was supposed to be this new shopping centre. Now it was just all these half-finished buildings looking like a ghost town. There were huge piles of rusted steel beams, pyramids of giant concrete pipes, little mountains of dirt, deep pits that had filled up with black, muddy water, and a creaking, rusted construction crane that I had climbed once while Marco stayed below and told me I was being an idiot. It was a totally deserted place, full of shadows and sounds that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. When Marco and I went there during the day, we always found these beer cans and liquor bottles. Sometimes we found the ashes of little campfires back in the hidden nooks and crannies of the buildings. So we knew that people came there at night. All that was on my mind as we crept through the site. You head out on foot, exploring your new town. Not so different from the last one. Dunkin' Donuts, Burger King, Walmart, Home Depot, a mall with the usual stuff inside, Mrs. Fields, The Gap, Express. You don't want to go in there. Don't want to face another crowd of strange faces. Instead, you dodge traffic and head into an abandoned construction site. On one end, a highway, bands of trees on the other side. On the far end, a broad field. Deserted place, a ghost town, a great place to be alone. So those are two descriptions of the area that come together quite nicely. They basically say the same thing, but taking it from two completely different books, I think solidifies what this place is supposed to look like. And I think this is a relatively good description. So you've got this light brown road stuff, and there's pits everywhere, there's debris, you can see all that there. There's a crane, which for the purposes of this, imagine it's abandoned. I don't think this site's actually abandoned. And you've got all this stuff here, and behind it you've got a row of trees, and further behind, buildings. Because this construction site it's near to the mall, very near, because the description there from Animorphs 2 makes that pretty clear. He looked at the mall but thought, actually no, I'll just cross the road into that construction site. So it's only separated by a highway from this big mall. Which does raise a few questions when it comes to how did nobody see this ship landing a few times? But there must have been something else in the way. Maybe the highway was stretched over, like one of those ones, you know what I mean. But imagine this building in the background here, if you can just about see that. There's a white building over there. That must be like something like the mall. So distant enough that things could happen here that nobody would see, but not too far away where it's a massive walk. So this sort of area, and also if it's hidden by something like that as well, like this big structure. Okay? But for all intents and purposes, this construction site is abandoned, and that's why Jake described seeing things like beer cans everywhere, liquor bottles. And as we'll see later, it's become a bit of a homeless place where the homeless people go. So that's a pretty good description. Let's go over a few more quotes that just add little descriptions of what else can be found there. Just little snippets which give us more of a visual picture of what this place looks like. We all just stood there as the ship hummed and glowed and slowly settled down in an open space between piles of junk and tumbled walls. Tobias rocked back like he'd been shocked. Then he, too, was up and running, stumbling over the loose junk and potholes of the construction site. The ship settled towards the ground. It looked like it was going to land directly on a big rusted earth mover parked there, but as the Visser's ship descended, the earth mover just sizzled and disappeared. The bug fighters came to rest on either side. They looked so strange, parked between the yellow painted earth movers and graders in the construction site. A doorway. Inside, it was as black as a grave. It was one of the buildings that had almost been completed. Just bare concrete walls and scattered junk. But I knew I'd been in here before. Mark and I had walked through it. There were hallways and little side rooms. It was like a maze. It was a man. He'd been lying on the ground, wrapped in a blanket. I ran along the top of the wall. Made from cinder block, it was full of holes and only a few centimetres wide. It was 3 metres to the ground, and the ground was covered with rusted, twisted metal. I led the way down to one of several unfinished buildings. It was just 4 walls with a few doorless doorways. I think it was originally going to be a mini market before the whole thing got cancelled, or maybe a fast food place. In the concrete floor of the never-to-be-finished building was a drain. The drain cover was off. Last Saturday you chose a spot and yanked away the worst debris. You made this sort of single-track loop. It has a killer rolling dip and log made out of cinder blocks that you can jump. My apologies for the sheer volume of quotes there, but I think those all just add those little bits of description which give you a good idea of the state of this place. So it's just full of holes everywhere, so it's probably been abandoned for quite a bit of time. There's of course homeless people sleeping there, just bits of debris everywhere, scattered metal. So it's seen some rough times. And we also get a lot of buildings. They're not finished, but some of them are more complete than others. So we've had some buildings described as nearly finished with all the corridors put in and doorways. And then you get some that are basically just 4 walls. But there's also a drain in at least some of these buildings, which implies that it's been connected to underground drainage. So you can imagine that this construction site actually went quite far. Why was it abandoned? We can only really speculate. But as we look at some of the plot points of this place, it might become more clear why this place eventually became abandoned. And if we look at this picture here, if you can imagine structures like this, if it's going to be like a big shopping mall, as I believe it suggested in The Invasion, you're going to have these big structures everywhere, and they've got loads of earth movers, big things that surround you, block you from view. So keep that all in mind as we discuss the plot points surrounding the construction site. But before that, let's just look at the placement of the construction site. Okay, so I've brought up MS Paint here and one of these drawing tablet things. And let's map this out. So one of the big features that we know is next to this construction site is the mall. So let's just say that this is the mall, okay, and then that's separated from the construction site by a highway. Forgive the freaking awful drawing. So let's just say that that is the highway. The construction site is here, so we'll label that CS for construction site, and you've got all these scattered buildings around here like that, maybe a big one there, earth movers. So that's your construction site, and it's surrounded on 2 sides by tree. Oh, hold on, I'll do green. Probably makes more sense. So surrounded on 2 sides by trees, and then over this side is a field. Okay, so that's the basic layout that we have here. We can imagine that this road is actually bigger than what is represented there, and there's probably more distance from the construction site to the mall. And the Animorphs all travel, so let's represent the Animorphs with this colour here. So obviously they start at the mall, all 5 of them, and they're all heading home. And we can imagine that Cassie lives in a rural area because she's got a barn. Tobias and Marco probably live at the poor side of town. And Jake and Rachel probably live on the more not so poor side of town. But they all go through this way. So they all live probably on like that. So they're not spread around. They all come from roughly the same direction relative to the mall. But they all have to pass through this because the long way around, if you'll excuse me, As the long way round, which they do talk about, would probably take them down this road or up here to eventually circle round. So that is probably what the whole layout of this construction site and mall thing is. But I imagine maybe we've got more trees blocking the mall from sight here. Because to me that makes sense. Because then you won't get people looking from a busy part of town at this construction site where, if we look at the plot, is quite a hive of alien activity. Okay? We could probably also imagine that this field is quite long, so it's a big barren stretch of field on the other side of this chain-linked fence construction site all the way around. So that is what I believe to be a good representation of the construction site. Now let's look at the plot points behind this thing, because it is quite important, and it doesn't start at book 1, surprisingly. Chronologically, we start with the Andalite Chronicles, and it's all to do with the time matrix. The big creation by the Elmis, that big sphere, is there. The time matrix was a sphere, taller than a human. Destroying it was physically impossible, but it could be hidden, for a while at least. He found an empty place, nothing but trees. Using only the equipment available to any human, he dug a hole and rolled the device into it. He covered it. Many years later, he returned to the same spot, desperate enough to try to use the time matrix. The spot had become a construction site. This time, there would be no escape. His time ran out, just a few yards from the machine that could have given him all the time in the world. I landed here now in this construction site because I was looking for a great weapon, the time matrix. By the time I landed, I was too weak from my injuries to even think about finding the time matrix. It was buried beneath the concrete foundation of a half-finished building. What had once been peaceful forest was now a construction site. So Elfangor had the time matrix, but he needed somewhere to put it. And so he found a forest, a forested area, which implies that it was a little while ago, probably even before the mall was built. A secluded area where there weren't many people around, and he buried this huge ball. But over time, it became that, which raises a lot of questions. Now, there's also a part in this series, specifically in Megamorphs 3, where somebody, a Yerk with the host John Berryman, finds the time matrix and unburies it. But it remains there because of all the time travel shenanigans that they get up to in that book. And here's the quote just to prove that point. Berryman had never existed. The time matrix was where he had found it, buried. And that is where it remains, which again brings about a few questions further down the line. But before we get to that bit, why was this construction site abandoned? Was the time matrix something to do with it? So as they're digging up this place, they maybe got closer to just about figuring out where this time matrix was. It must have been so close to the surface, hence why John Berryman would stumble upon it. It wasn't too far. He didn't go there with a shovel on a freaking whim. Dig, 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 I'm going to find my way to China. Oh, what the fuck is this thing? Zap, oh shit, I'm in World War II now. No, it wasn't like that. So I imagine this construction got a bit too close to this time matrix, and maybe this mystical Elmist created object had some effect on what was going on with the construction site. Maybe strange things started happening. I don't know. Cavemen started appearing here or there. Big Bazza, with the who carries the girders around, maybe he disappeared one day. He was there one day, and then the next day somebody found a newspaper article. Oh, there's Big Baz. Hold on a minute. Why isn't he in a museum on a painting from the 1600s? Maybe something like that happened. And the place was abandoned because maybe they thought it was haunted. Something was there haunting them. But there are other explanations as well. Possible explanations. So when do we next come across the construction site? Of course, it's in Animorphs Book 1, The Invasion. Why? Because that's where Prince Elfangor lands as he's searching for this time matrix. But at that point, he's too badly injured and cannot search for it. And that's when the Yerks come down. And of course the Animorphs are there, because why wouldn't they be there? They could have gone the long way round, as they explain quite clearly. "You guys going home?" I asked Rachel. "You shouldn't go through the construction site by yourselves. I mean, being girls and all." To get home from the mall, we could either go a long way around, which is the safe way, or we could cut through this abandoned construction site and hope there weren't any axe murderers hanging around there. My mum and dad have sworn to ground me until I'm 20 if they ever found out I'd cut through the construction site. So anyway, we crossed the road and headed into the abandoned construction site. So we get the first scene, the most famous scene possibly from the Animorphs series occurring at this time. Elfangor is killed, his ship destroyed, and the blue box mysteriously seems to disappear. We come to the construction site again in the next episode though, and we possibly answer the question of why this place was abandoned yet again, a second possible reason. Where's Columbo in all of this, you might ask? But the site is referred to as a landing site for the Yeerks. Listen to this. "Bring it to me," Visser 3 said enthusiastically. "Bring it to me. I will come to collect it at the nearest landing site." Chapman lifted me out of the back seat. I looked through the bars. "We're at the construction site," I told Jake. So the Yeerks consider it an actual landing site, a place for ships to come up and down. So why was this place abandoned? Well, maybe it was never meant to be completed. Maybe the Yeerks, as they're here, think, right, we need somewhere near in the middle of the city somewhere to have ships come down and go up again without being seen. We'll do a fake construction site. They've done fake businesses before, like Daps and Lumber, where they hire out all this massive lumber company and do work in the woodlands and the forests and in the local area. So it's not beyond the Yeerks' ability to do this sort of thing. So was this construction site a Yeerk operation all along that was never meant to be finished, but was meant to be built up enough that you couldn't see what was going on inside? That's potentially an Annie theory for another day, but that's a possible explanation for why this thing is here in the first place. And so near to the mall where we know that there are entrances to the Yeerk pool, a lot of human activity. On the other side is an empty field. So seems like a smart place for the Yeerks to build, honestly, so I wouldn't be surprised. Or would I? Because let's be honest, Visser 3 isn't very smart. Yeah. Anyway, in Book 2, the Animorphs activate Earth Movers. These are the quotes. "All at once, through the open door of the blade ship, I spotted the Earth Mover. It lumbered at a painfully slow speed, but it lumbered right towards the blade ship. A second Earth Mover was grinding forward on its tank treads. Marco and Cassie had started up another Earth Mover." Now, why is this important? It might give us some more clues as to what's truly going on here. Back when I did my review of this book, I gave it the hashtag Keygate thing. But I thought, that's a bit plot conveniency. They've just left keys inside these Earth Movers, and there are plenty of these around, by the way. Remember, in Book 1, one of them got sizzled and disappears. Now there's 2 more, so there's quite a few of these things hanging around. And they all seem to have keys left inside of them, because how else are the animals going to start them up? Hardly expect them to get into the wires of these things, so yeah, they must have had their keys still in there. Was that an Elemist trick? It could be. I wouldn't be too surprised if it was the Elemist playing around. This place is full of activity, the time matrix is there, maybe that allows him to use his powers more effectively if his big machine is there. Maybe Cassie is an Elemist plant and he used Cassie to somehow magic these things into power. She has got other magical powers. Maybe it was something to do with the fact that it was a Yeerk landing site. For whatever reason, the Yeerks, when they land or take off, they need these Earth Movers, and so these things, even though it's an abandoned construction site, they still are operational in this area. Which makes you wonder why they consider the place abandoned. I don't know. But that's another possible explanation. It would just need a little bit of thinking on the practicalities of it. Maybe these Earth Movers are still secretly being used as stuff is going on this confirmed landing site for the Yeerks. However, after Book 2, the Yeerks don't as far as I remember, don't come back down to the construction site again. We can safely say, as with many other things in this series, that as soon as Visser 3 noted that the Andalite bandits knew about this place, that he scrapped it and said, right, we can't use that place anymore. So that was probably it for the official landing site for the Yeerks. They probably went and found another one. In fact, I think they did. Which book was it where there was a lot? Where there's a big hologram and... Maybe there are holograms as well. Consider that, okay? So the Yeerks have... I'm thinking on the fly, you can probably tell. The Yeerks have been shown to use holograms, and very effective holograms. Maybe with help from the Chi. Going back to the whole Chi-spiracy thing. Double-crossing bastards. Maybe the construction site looks abandoned because there are holograms everywhere. Maybe. And that's why the Earth Movers have still got the keys in it, because the Yeerks feel safe in the knowledge that nobody's going to see these things moving around, because unless you're inside of the construction site, you aren't going to see work happening. Maybe, but this is getting very speculative now, so I'm going to reel it back in. I'm going to reel it back in, and we're going to carry on with the plot. So we can assume that the Yeerks aren't really active here anymore. What happened to this thing? Apart from it breaking. What was that all about? It's because you're here. Freaking go away. Poisoning everything. What happened to... Oh, it is broken. Oh no, it's probably not. It probably just needs more charge, so whatever. It'll probably shut off again. Where the fuck was I? Yep, there it goes. Anyway, this construction site now no longer Yeerk operation. David, at some point, stumbles across this construction site. What happens to that blue box? Well, we find out. Somehow, it ended up buried in amongst a wall. Here are a couple of quotes. "Hey, David," I yelled after him. "What's that blue thing?" He turned back towards me. "I don't know. I found it. It was in that construction site over across from the shopping mall. In a hole in a wall. Inside the cement block. Like it had been put in there or something. You land 3 rocks in a row, right on the same spot in the concrete. When the third hits, the concrete crumbles. Weird. That stuff is usually pretty strong. You're heading out of the lot when you see it. A small box nestled down inside the concrete block that fell apart. Sky blue, very plain, small. Maybe 5 inches to each side." Now, as much as we speculate on how canon we can say Old Animorphs 2 is, I think we can probably safely say that this is an accurate description of what probably happened as David finds the blue box. So it's almost like it's been placed in a wall behind something, which is very strange and makes you wonder if the Elmist or Kryak might have been involved in this process somehow, of this single blue box surviving this blast. How it somehow survived it all and ended up covered up inside of a concrete block wall for David to then find. It is very strange. But that's where he finds it, and that's where he meets his eventual fate. I led the way to the construction site. The construction site where everything had begun so long ago, where Elfangor had given us our powers. It was also the place where David had found the blue box. "Ah yes," he said, "of course. The last place I would have looked for it. You put it back where it started out." So just like the Time Matrix, the blue box was returned, supposedly, to the construction site. Of course, then it was taken away again. But this is, the construction site is where David is trapped inside a drainage system, which we covered earlier, and he's turned into a rat Nothlit. So that's near enough what we see from the construction site for the remainder of the series. But what happens to the construction site at the end? Remember, this is where the Time Matrix is hidden, so it's still technically quite an important place, even as we come to the end and pass through the end of the series. What happens to the town? Because maybe that'll help answer that question. The destruction was breathtaking. Below us, there was a sinkhole where much of the town had been. Everything had just caved in. Half the mall, several office buildings, train stations, shops, all had gone. most of the town had simply collapsed, swallowed up by an explosion the size of a small nuclear blast. So that's describing the destruction of the town as the earth pool caves in, so the whole ground would have caved in. But it's clarified in there, half the mole. So if we go back to our drawing here, half the mole, so we can assume that it's come from somewhere around the mole. Now, if the destruction of the mole was on this side, then we can assume that the construction site would collapse and the time matrix, which is still buried there, would fall into this crater. Or what I think is the more likely scenario, considering the Elemist is involved with this time matrix thing, this half the mole is destroyed. That half remains, which means that the stuff behind it, assumedly, also remains, which means the time matrix is left unscathed. Because remember, even if this collapses, it's said that the destruction of the time matrix is physically impossible, or near enough to physically impossible. So that crumbling into the earth pool cavern probably won't destroy it, and then it would potentially be found again. Or, alternately, maybe it would be buried even deeper, but it's under loose rubble. So I think the more likely scenario is this, that somehow it only takes half the mole and leaves the area where the time matrix is unscathed. Will another John Berryman come over at some point and find the time matrix again? Or is this construction site gonna just be completely gone? Would they pave over it? That's a speculation altogether. So I think that covers the construction site quite nicely. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know I have. And stay tuned for the next one. So there's going to be plenty coming up. The next two confirmed AniLysis videos are going to be on SM239 and Cassie, of which I've done half the research for Cassie. So it's coming closer. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in next time. Ta-ra!